Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dal, and this week's War Within beta build saw a significant amount of class changes, from hunters to death knights to mages, and we've covered just about all of those classes, but we haven't taken a look at druids recently, with the spec of feral druids finally getting some kind of a damage improvement. Generally, druids have been perceived as some class that's been a little bit undertuned over on the beta, but with ferals finally receiving some buffs, I actually got very excited, and I needed to check them out as soon as I could. Besides this, druids have also seen some adjustments when it comes to the hero talents, primarily to try to make all of the different hero talent options more even when it comes to choosing them between specs such as Guardian or Feral Druid, for instance, to try to make sure that all of them are a little bit more even and not one option feels like a winner over the other, at least for the Season 1 content. As always, if you guys enjoy these regular class updates or overviews for the War Within beta, be sure to follow the channel. Otherwise, let's dive right in. So starting off, we have some general druid changes with a bit of survivability buffs actually. Abilities such as renewal, a backup to 30% worth of heal every time you press it instead of being 20%. A very slight adjustment, but I feel like one that is kind of noticeable when it comes to some of the hectic situations. Also, if you do pick up Frenzied Regen, that is back up to 32% of your health over 3 seconds, which is huge. This is down for Guardian Druid specifically. They're just trying to adjust like the tank healing and tank survivability, but otherwise this number is back up for Resto, Boomkin, as well as Feral Druid, which is nice. It doesn't mean you have to pop in a bear form to use it, but still, I guess it is some better survivability overall though. Besides this, a good portion of Feral changes from this week's build primarily deals with some of the different hero talents. I actually don't need to spec into this one to show this enough, as Druid of the Claw is actually getting a couple of adjustments, primarily for Feral Druid, where Bestial Strength is now going to increase the damage of bite, but also rampant ferocity by 8%. What this means is the rampant ferocity being a talent for feral druids, which is how you end up AoEing. This has been a pretty decent adjustment for druids recently, where instead of doing a lot of their cleave from spamming Primal Wrath, consuming your bleeds, having that bleed damage be more instant, now you do bites, and every enemy with a rip also takes a bit of that cleave damage. They added that in to make sure that your primary way of doing AoE damage is being improved with all of the other AoE abilities. Also, for Feral Druids in particular, Ravage as an ability is kind of like an empowered version of Ferocious Bite that also has this like AoE cleave in a frontal arc. That cleave for Feral Druids in particular is being amplified by 25%, which is a good buff. I mean, it's more AoE damage, and the Ravage ability could actually do quite a significant number of damage with that cleaving effect. The drop for wound bleed that applies after using a Ravage has also been amplified by 10%, which is an okay bit of damage. Not the craziest amount, but hey, we'll take the bleeds if we can get it. Plus the bleed scales with the mastery of a Feral Druid in all the different ways, so that's really good. And even gets amplified by Tiger's Fury snapshot mechanic, which is also pretty cool. So for Feral Druid, it is a significant gain if you do end up picking up Druid of the Claw. Jumping over really quickly to the Guardian Druid for Elun's Chosen changes, because Guardian is seeing even more nerfs. Elun's Chosen has proven itself to be a pretty popular pick for Guardian Druids when it comes to higher end dungeons, and some of the key elements of Elun's Chosen are being nerfed, such as the damage buff of Boundless Moonlight. Lunar Beam now causes you to leech damage, or leech for a portion of all damage dealt by the beam, but Fury of Elune will also have additional astral damage behind it, so the damage of Boundless Moonlight seeing a 70% damage reduction, which is unfortunate. Also, besides this, Lunar Insight has been changed, where the damage of Moonfire is reduced from 20% amp to a 10% amp, so you're seeing less of a damage increase. This is going to affect druids in a couple of different ways. So lunar abilities give them a couple of different elements, such as Twin Moonfire, where Moonfire can deal more damage and spread to targets really easily. So getting a bunch of Moonfires on everybody with Galactic Guardian is pretty easy. Getting the damage debuff from Scintillating Moonlight is also helpful, but also the self-healing from Elune's Favored is significant, where you deal 10% additional arcane damage all across the board and are healed for a portion of all arcane damage dealt. They're trying to see if they can kind of even out Guardian survivability either through physical bleed damage with Ursa's Fury, with a shield, or self-healing of Elune's Favored, and they're trying to, I think, make sure that neither the Arcane Bear or the Blade, Maul, Thrash Raise Bear, the physical damage, Bleed Bear, the Thrash Bear, whatever you want to call it. Both of them are as even as possible no matter which build you end up investing points into. So Erlin's Chosen is taking a bit of a hit. And from there, we jump back into the feral form for Wild Stalker. I definitely could have structured that a little bit differently, but here we are. So Blood Seeker Vines, the main ability of the Thriving Grove, where your Rip and Rake have a chance to grow a Blood Seeker Vine. That damage of the vines is been reduced by 10%. It is still a significant amount of damage that it puts out, but yeah, 10% reduction. We are seeing a buff for Bursting Growth, however. When Bloodseeker Vines expire or you use a Ferocious Bite on a target with the vine, it deals instantaneous physical damage to all nearby enemies. So that damage is amped by 30%. That can be noticeable at times. It is a little bit behind for Bloodseeker Vines, but it's a nice benefit in AoE. Also, Bond with Nature passive option right here is a little bit more effective, where you take 4% more healing instead of 3%. So slight little changes here and there, but primarily this is a decent bit of buffs for Feral Druids between the Wild Stalker, which is a very passive bleed heavy option, or Druid of the Claw, which is more of this bite heavy Druid affinity playstyle. And as part of this update, Feral Druids are receiving buffs all across the board to try to help them catch up a little bit. Part of this change is also going to be adjusting some of the bite focused damage sources into other sources such as bleeds, as well as your common point builders, which I think is generally good. The spec itself is feeling much slower paced compared to its Dragonflight version, so you're not nearly getting as many frequent bites that you can use outside of primary major cooldowns, because your major cooldowns are tied to a lot of your resource generation and resource spending and resource management. So this means that you should hopefully have a little bit better damage outside of those major abilities, since bleeds as well as the calm point builders are constantly used, as long as these abilities are tuned correctly. So we're seeing a damage buff for abilities such as your Rip in order to be 10% more effective, so that is pretty good. Rampant Ferocity, which actually has a damage scaling to it. I still remember the older version of this ability, but at some point throughout a few beta builds, they added for Rampant Ferocity, which is your primary way of doing AoE damage. You know how bites as a feral has this like a mechanic where if, let's say, you can consume more energy into a ferocious bite to have it do additional damage, so you can really be more efficient with the energy spent, thus resulting in a kind of a slower pace for feral druid. So that mechanic of consuming more energy to deal more damage also applies for Rampant Ferocity. So if you are having to wait out for your bite and you have that damage scaled upwards where it consumes more energy, Rampant Ferocity also scales up in the very similar way, which is a noticeable change and a nice buff in general. I think it's a really good change overall. Also does help give Feral more of this funnel-based playstyle. And funnel-based gameplay has generally been historically pretty good, or rather pretty powerful, like in Mythic Plus and even in raids, because in every PvE encounter there's usually some form of a mob that you need to focus on and kill it as soon as possible. Whether we talk about the new affixes being added for this first season of War Within expansion, with the some of the different ghosties that are going to be available, like Xalatath popping up, and you got to focus her as soon as you can, otherwise she gives too much of like a big damage buff to all enemies inside of a trash pack. Or there's usually some caster that needs to be eliminated as quickly as possible, or some big elite in between of it all, and you want to have that focused damage that ends up being more effective, but you still want to be able to do damage to everything around you without necessarily having this pad damage that doesn't really become effective. And the final type of gameplay for Feral Druid to be able to spread bleeds, get those big bites so you have more single target focus damage. Rampant Ferocity provides that free cleave to everything around you, while you're still able to funnel a huge portion of your damage into the focus target. And that kind of a profile is generally really good, and it's kind of an awesome thing about Feral Druids with this Rampant Ferocity AoE change, that you are a little more focused. Now I do think it's going to affect like your overall ability to spread and deal AoE damage in like the uncapped situations, where I feel like Primal Wrath was better there. But if you are looking at more focused situations, I think it is probably healthier to have that kind of a profile than just pure pad AoE damage as a feral. So it's cool that they're doing some more changes with Rampant Ferocity. Tasteful Blood is also being dialed back a bit. As they said, they want to take some of the power out of the bites a little, put it back into other abilities. So Tasteful Blood used to give Ferocious Bite 15% more damage and additional 15% during Tiger's Fury. Both of those values have been reduced to 12% baseline, 12% additional for Tiger's Fury, so quite a bit of it does get removed. Then we also have Apex Predator Craving talent, which has been adjusted, where apparently the chance for this one to proc has been increased, and it's just a little when it comes to like big, large, high target situations where you're able to spread rips on a bunch of targets, trying to get more of those ferocious bite resets. You kind of sort of feel it, but I feel like this talent ends up falling into what we like to call a feast or a famine type of situation. So there are some moments where you run in, spread rips on everybody, and you're just getting back-to-back procs of Apex Spiritual Craving, biting over and over and over, and your damage really scales up with it, and you're doing just a giga amounts of damage during the apex of your cooldowns. And other times you don't get a lot of procs, or as many as you did with the other trash pack, and the damage differences are quite noticeable. And I wonder if that is something they can maybe do in the future, so this talent could feel more, I guess, consistent. Like, it's kind of like a bad luck protection. Like, every time you tick with rips, there's a chance that you'll get ferocious bite, and every time you don't get it, it scales up. So there's a bit more consistency, or like give it like a guarantee amount of procs that it can do within every so many seconds or every minute or whatever. Just something to give more consistency between different trash packs, I think would be really good, because there are times when you get a bunch of procs and you're top of the meters, and other times when you don't get a bunch of procs and it just feels like not as good. It feels like you're just losing out on what potentially could have been value, and not everybody enjoys that much RNG. Another thing for Feral Druid that has been amplified by quite a bit is all of your basic combo point builders, things like Shred, Swipe, Brutal Slash, Thrash, Lunar Inspiration, Moonfire, and Rake, but only the initial damage of these abilities increased by 30%, which is quite noticeable. That is quite a bit of a damage increase. So all your basic abilities hit a little harder. This is good for the most part, because like things such as, let's say, like Rake, it has initial damage and then the bleed damage, so this only applies for the initial hit. Same thing with the Moonfire. If you do end up playing into Lunar Inspiration, same thing happens there as well. So it's kind of good, but like Thrash, for example, has some initial damage, but you mostly want it for the bleed, or rather for the debuff, so I guess it's okay there. I don't know. It's like, it's kind of nice, but I just feel like a good portion of feral abilities is the dot aspect, and I'm surprised that, I mean, 30% buff is the 30% buff for those basic combo point builders. Don't get me wrong. I don't know. I just feel like thematically it would have been cool to include that dot component, at least maybe like a little reduced value or something, but maybe that would have been too much in terms of tuning for feral. Just would have made sense in my opinion. Berserk also has been buffed up by quite a bit in a couple of different ways. So Berserk now is a much more limited of a burst window, 15 seconds, 2-minute cooldown. The most you can reduce it from a 3-minute to a 2-minute with Heart of the Lion upgrade talent. And they increase the damage of this ability, where once you use Berserk, all auto attack abilities, auto attacks, and ability damage is increased now by 15% instead of 10, which is a noticeable change. I'm still not a big fan of like the shortened duration of Berserk. It feels like it runs out way too quickly, and a 2-minute cooldown cap is, I guess it's nice, but I kind of like that you could have it reduced even further with the original version of Heart of the Lion, where you reduce the cooldown of the ability for every either comp point spent or comp point generated. I can't remember which one it used to be, but yeah, it still is a very effective talent, and the buff for it is kind of nice. Combined together with the Frenzy upgrade, they have actually improved the bleed damage of this one as well. During your Berserk, your comp point generating abilities bleed the target for an additional 150% of the direct damage over 8 seconds, with the raw 30% damage buff they saw for Shred, Brutal Slash, Thrash, Swipe, all those basic combat abilities. All of those now also benefit with Frenzy, so they almost kind of get to double dip into all the different benefits, and not only do they hit harder, but then the bleed is better and the bleed get buffed up. So it's actually kind of a noticeable change overall, and I like this one in general. Primal Wrath is an ability. The initial direct damage of this ability has been increased. Primal Wrath is mostly, I mean, when you take a look at the overall breakdown of Primal Wrath, it is mostly there just for the application, not really there for the raw damage itself. It's mostly just the payload to get the rips up and running. Not necessarily as good of an ability as it used to be. But yeah, it's got it buffed up by a little, so that's nice. Also, Adaptive Swarm buffed up by 20%, so that may be good in like certain single target encounters that are very bleed heavy. And I feel like with Wildstalker, how it's so bleed heavy as well, that'll probably be a very easy synergy. However, recently I did get to read through some of the Feral forum posts with some of the different suggestions, and there was a forum post that actually added an idea that Feral has a lot of buttons. There's a lot of buttons in terms of just how many abilities you need to have. Not only do you have all of your combat abilities, but also when you add like all the different utilitarian abilities, your bar gets quite full very, very quickly. So somebody suggested, what if Adaptive Swarm became some kind of like a passive effect? Because it feels like compared to some of the other classes out there, Feral Bar ends up feeling a little bloated. And we've seen a lot of classes go through quite a variety of different changes and adjustments over this expansion in particular in terms of their, I guess, rotational buttons. So most classes are about the same. Some have in a way been even a little pruned, but like in a good way, where certain abilities can kind of combine together, Windwalker Monk being one of the few actually. So somebody floated the idea of like, what if Adaptive Swarm was more of a passive rather than an active? And I actually think that would make it a little bit more usable. I also would love to see Unbridled Swarm just become part of Adaptive Swarm naturally, because it feels like it's quite a bit of a talent point investment. In single target, I'm pretty sure the Adaptive Swarm is just perfectly fine, but I don't know. What would you guys say about Adaptive Swarm at some point potentially becoming a passive in the future? Besides this, the Spec of Guardian has saw even more nerfs. They're still trying to figure out the tuning for tanks, but don't be worried, it's not too crazy amount of nerfs, but core key things have been adjusted, like your Dream of Scenarios heal. When you take non-periodic damage, you have a chance equal to your crit chance to allow your next regrowth to heal for additional healing, which can be used on other allies, so you can off-heal a friend, or you can use it for yourself to give yourself a heal. That heal has been reduced from, instead of 200% buff for regrowth, to 130% buff, so that has been downclocked a little bit, but that's more like a, I guess, self-survivability, but also I like the ability, how you could utilize the ability to heal another character in general, somebody else in your party, like an off-heal. So that is also getting affected here as well. The tier set for Guardian Druids also has been slightly adjusted. The 4 set in particular, as you can actually see right here. So they have the bleed effect. The 4 set arcane damage you deal is increased by 5%, and blade damage you deal is increased by 8%. So they actually buffed up the bleed damage, primarily I think to try to make the arcane playstyle with Illusion's Chosen less favored, but try to give them more of like, hey, if you want to play like a full bleed build with Druid of the Claw, we want to make sure that that one is supported. Here's some bleed damage to make that Ursek's Fury a little better. So that could also be an interesting change. So that is a little buff, like a very, very slight one, but does do a little bit more for damage and survivability. But also, we saw earlier, Friends at Regen, it is nerfed for Guardian Druid, but back up to full value for every other Druid. Overall though, when it comes to testing out Feral Druids over on the beta with all these different changes, but also checking out some of the different logs, which there isn't a lot of players playing Feral or testing Feral when it comes to some of the high-end dungeons over on the beta, which I think just says something about where they are in terms of the popularity. Feral's never really been a very popular pick for Mythic Plus, or relatively hasn't been that popular in comparison to some of the more popular choices. However, it is a fun playstyle, and I feel like the slowdown that it's seen over for the War Within compared to Dragonflight, with a bit of a more methodical playstyle, isn't really a lot to adjust to. So I feel like players that played Feral maybe in previous expansions will find this playstyle, if anything, more familiar, but in overall, it isn't like a detriment to the overall gameplay or Feral Druid or anything like that. The damage buffs compared to the previous weeks do feel a little bit more noticeable, although I am still going to put an emphasis on the Apex Predator talent, the Feast or Famine mechanic. If you are getting a lot of bites, it does reflect it in your current damage meters, at least in terms of what I've been able to test over on the beta. So I feel like there should be some kind of consistency with that talent and the procs, because if you're getting a bunch of procs, it feels amazing. It feels you're just demolishing, just devouring everything as a Feral Druid, and it feels really, really good. Inside of your full set of cooldowns, Feral feels at its peak, but if you're not getting a lot of those procs, it does feel like you're having to spend more time investing into combo points, more time building for that kind of a damage before you can really truly unleash that kinds of damage as well. Also, when it comes to testing our dungeons, we did get into a double fortified and a double seasonal affixes. I'm not exactly sure how it's happened, but recently a few dungeons have had those double affixes pop up here and there as of this week specifically, which does mean that enemies have quite a bit of additional health for us to chew through. And I think that does end up kind of adding on to like the actual damage of a Feral Druid. In some of the longer living trash packs, it does feel like you get an opportunity to build up to your damage with the bleeds, with the bites, and all the other components that play into it. Overall, I like the changes to the funnel-based gameplay with rampant ferocity and how it scales with your bites. Playing around with it, it is a very different compared to this bleed, heavy AoE cleave playstyle that gives you a lot of this like multi-target scaling to it. But the funnel-based gameplay, I think it's going to be good and generally probably universally good, no matter what type of AoE encounters you end up going into when it comes to dungeons. That being said, I would love to see Feral Druid being a very popular pick going forward, but I just don't really know if they exactly have what it takes, because right now, Feral Druid is still in a situation going into War Within where they didn't necessarily solve some of the weaknesses of the spec. It doesn't have anything that's unique to a Feral Druid specifically, kind of like how Wind Fury used to be unique for enhancement shamans. Feral Druids essentially bring the same utility as every other Druid, but they're put in melee with the bleeds and that type of a profile. And the only thing that can really let them stand out is having maybe more damage than some of the alternatives, like more focused single target damage or crazy amounts of AoE, because they don't necessarily bring anything unique to the table. They also are lacking things like an immunity, like some of that rogues and demon hunters have, which has given them an edge over Feral Druid or some of the other agility classes in the past. Hell, even survival hunters with their profile, how they have an immunity, better self-defenses, a better profile for AoE damage, and overall the rework has been so good, I feel like that should have been something that Feral probably should have gotten at some point throughout the rework. Also, take a look at this week's log specifically with this set of new Feral buffs, and it doesn't seem to be an uptick in terms of more players checking them out for some of the higher end game content. And when players are diving into some of the more difficult dungeons like 10s, 11s, 12s, 13s, because keys are still a little bit overtuned on the beta, but it also creates an opportunity for us to be able to see how those classes deal with the pressure and the extra additional damage and the higher difficulty that the key level suggests. Feral Druids are not seeing an uptick in terms of players playing them or giving them a proper go, which isn't ideal, isn't really what you wanted to see, but still, a buff is a buff. We'll take it. I'm just wondering if Feral Druids will be able to come out on top somewhere or find some sort of popularity somewhere when it comes to PvE content going forward. Though if anything I'd like to see out of Druids in the future is potentially another look again at the class talents. Recently that's been brought up back up as a more of a conversational topic when it comes to Druids in particular, not just Feral Druids, where we've seen the class adjustments for Death Knights, Monks, and even classes like Hunters, where their class talents have been revamped in the best ways possible. And in comparison, while Druids did get a new set of talents for War Within compared to Dragonflight, and while it is a slightly better version, it's only a very slightly better version. Like, it's not, doesn't necessarily solve some of the main core issues that Druids generally have had so far in the War Within throughout its development. The talents have quite a bit of rigidity, and you end up picking up a lot of different abilities that you don't necessarily use in raids or maybe in dungeons or even in PvP. You're picking up a lot of abilities and talents that are not really integrated into your playstyle, just to pick up some of the lower level options, lower row options, some of the more powerful options that are a performance gain, or maybe even some of the capstone choices, but you pick up a lot of the talents that don't necessarily help your spec specifically do well. Like picking up Shred and Bite and Thrash damage for Feral Druids just so you can receive well-honed instincts, or picking up more Moonfire and Sunfire damage as a Feral just so you can grab Innervate as a raid. So hopefully we'll see some much needed adjustments for the class of Druids in the future, hopefully sooner than later. But with that being said, that's going to be basically my entire overview of everything that has happened to Druids, primarily focusing on Feral from this week's beta build. As always, I do want to thank all of you so much for watching this video, and hopefully you guys enjoyed. And if you did enjoy it and found the video informative, go ahead and give it a like. I would very, very much appreciate it. Join our Discord community and let me know all your thoughts of everything we talked about so far in the comment section down below. And as always, I'll see all of you guys in the next one.